Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of good than malice itself. Against evil, one can protest, can be denounced, it can be prevented by force. Against stupidity, we have no defense. These words are not mine. They were written by theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer while imprisoned in a Nazi cell, observing how the most educated nation in Europe had succumbed to active madness. What if stupidity wasn't what we always thought? A simple lack of information or low IQ? What if, in fact, it was something much more disturbing, an active refusal to think? What if the most intelligent, most educated, and most well-intentioned people you know were precisely the most vulnerable to this phenomenon? What if this force were, at this very moment, silently shaping our society, our politics, our relationships, without us even noticing its presence? Pause for a moment. Have you ever seen a respected healthcare professional, someone with years of scientific training, suddenly embrace treatments without evidence, against all their previous training? Or perhaps an intelligent family member, whom you've always admired, gradually distancing themselves from the family because of conspiracy theories, increasingly disconnected from reality? Or observed highly educated leaders, with access to experts and quality data, making disastrous decisions based on simplistic ideologies, ignoring evidence contrary to their viewpoints? If you've witnessed any of these scenarios, and most of us have, then you've observed firsthand the phenomenon that Bonhoeffer identified in his prison cell while watching the destruction of his nation. Here's the crucial: these people are not evil. They are not deliberately malicious. They are not necessarily dishonest. They are victims of what Bonhoeffer identified as functional stupidity, a specific type of cognitive failure that transcends intelligence, education, and even conventional morality. And here's the truly disturbing part, the one that demands our urgent attention. This condition doesn't just happen to them, the others, those we disagree with, those we consider irrational. It happens to people like, at this very moment, in some area of our lives, we are likely victims of this same phenomenon. Bonhoeffer's discovery is not just a historical curiosity or an observation about human nature. It is an urgent warning about a fundamental vulnerability in our mental structure, one that has become exponentially more dangerous in the hyper-connected and polarized world. The question is not whether you are intelligent or educated. The question is whether you have the tools to recognize and resist one of the most destructive forces ever identified in human psychology. A force that, as we will see, is all the more insidious the more intelligent you are. What I've just described is not cheap philosophy or some vague conspiracy theory. It is a documented psychological mechanism, a pattern of human behavior that has been observed, studied, and confirmed by both history and modern science. But before we explain exactly how this phenomenon works in your brain and how it might be affecting your decisions at this very moment, we need to understand who the man was who made this dangerous discovery, and why his observations, made almost 80 years ago, are more relevant today than ever. Who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Before we dive into this fascinating story, if you're appreciating this exploration of the human, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving content that illuminates the deepest corners of human psychology. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not an academic isolated in an ivory tower, theorizing comfortably about the human condition. He was a Lutheran pastor and theologian who had the historical misfortune and the unique opportunity to witness firsthand how the most cultured, technically advanced, and intellectually sophisticated nation in Europe, Germany, gradually succumbed to the deepest collective irrationality. Born in 1906 into a family of academics and scientists, his father was a respected psychiatrist. Bonhoeffer obtained his doctorate in theology at 21. He studied in the United States, traveled throughout Europe and Africa, and had a cosmopolitan worldview that placed him at the forefront of progressive thinking of his time. When Hitler rose to power in 1930, Bonhoeffer was perfectly positioned to observe, with horror and fascination, how German society, with its world-class universities, unparalleled philosophical tradition, and cultural sophistication, gradually embraced Nazi ideology. What he witnessed was not just the rise of a tyrant. It was something much more disturbing. He saw university professors, renowned doctors, respected judges, clergy, and intellectuals, people who should have been the guardians of reason and morality, voluntarily abdicating their critical thinking in favor of a simplistic and evidently irrational ideology. What made Bonhoeffer's observation so unique was his clarity in distinguishing this phenomenon from simple evil or ignorance. He realized that something more fundamental was happening, a kind of collapse of the faculty of a surrender of mental autonomy that affected precisely the people who should have been most resistant to such surrender. And Bonhoeffer was not just a passive observer. He joined the German resistance, participated in a plot to assassinate Hitler, and ended up paying with his own life for refusing to abdicate his critical thinking and moral integrity. He was hanged in April 1940, just 2 weeks before his concentration camp was liberated by the Allies. It was in this context, in a Nazi prison cell, observing the moral and intellectual catastrophe of his nation, that Bonhoeffer wrote his reflections on what he called stupidity, a term he used not in the common sense, but to describe this specific surrender of the faculty of thinking that he had witnessed among the German intellectual elite. What makes Bonhoeffer's observations even more disturbing is that, in the following decades, they were scientifically validated in the laboratory. In 1961, at Yale University, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most famous and controversial experiments in the history of psychology, motivated precisely by the question that tormented Bonhoeffer: how ordinary people can participate in immoral systems. Milgram designed an apparently simple experiment. Volunteers were recruited to participate in what they were told was a study on learning and memory. They were designated as teachers and instructed to apply increasingly strong electric shocks to a student, actually, an actor who did not receive real shocks. Each time the latter answered a question incorrectly, the results were shocking. 65% of participants obeyed the instructions to the end, administering what they believed to be potentially fatal 450-volt shocks to a person who screamed in pain and eventually fell silent. Simply because an authority figure the experiment requires that you continue. What Milgram discovered was precisely what Bonhoeffer had observed in ordinary Germans during Nazism: the frightening willingness of normal, ethical, and educated people to abdicate their moral and critical judgment when faced with an authority who assumed responsibility for their actions. As Milgram wrote, "The essence of obedience consists in the fact that a person comes to view themselves as an instrument carrying out another person's wishes, and therefore no longer regards themselves as responsible for their actions." This is the first rigorous scientific evidence of what Bonhoeffer observed, that there is a psychological mechanism by which intelligent and moral can voluntarily suspend their critical thinking and moral sense, delegating them to an external authority, be it a scientist in a lab coat, a charismatic leader, or even the social And this is just the first of several scientific discoveries that, as we will see next, not only confirm Bonhoeffer's observations, but expand them in ways that make his warning even more urgent for our. Because the functional stupidity that Bonhoeffer identified is not a historical relic of the totalitarian past. It is a fundamental aspect of human psychology that operates now, today, in our hyper-connected and polarized society, and in ways that Bonhoeffer, in his prison cell, could hardly imagine. The anatomy of functional stupidity. What exactly did Bonhoeffer mean by stupidity in his analyses of German society under Nazism? He certainly wasn't referring to a lack of conventional intelligence or formal education. After all, many of those who embraced Nazism were indisputably brilliant in the fields. Bonhoeffer perceived something much deeper and more disturbing, that this stupidity was not an intellectual defect, but fundamentally a moral and psychological one. In his own words, stupidity is a deeper problem than against stupidity, we have no defense. What he identified was what today we might call functional stupidity, the voluntary surrender of internal independence, the abdication of the responsibility to think critically in favor of accepting simplified narratives provided externally. It is functional because it can bring immediate benefits: social acceptance, psychological comfort, simplification of a complex world. But it is stupidity because it represents an abandonment of the faculty that makes us truly human, the ability to question, evaluate, and decide for ourselves. As Bonhoeffer observed, stupidity is a more dangerous enemy than malice itself. The stupid person, unlike the malicious one, is completely satisfied with himself. Indeed, he becomes dangerous by easily attacking when you feel challenged or resisted. In the decades since Bonhoeffer's observations, modern psychology has not only confirmed his intuitions, but provided a detailed scientific understanding of the exact mechanisms that produce this functional stupidity. Three fundamental scientific discoveries are particularly group conformity. Stupidity is sociological. In 1951, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted a series of experiments that demonstrated the overwhelming power of social pressure on our judgment. The experiment design was simple. Show a group of participants lines of different lengths and ask them to identify which line corresponded to a reference line. The ingenious part: everyone in the group except one participant were actors instructed to unanimously give the wrong answer in some round. The result was disturbing. Approximately 75% of the real participants denied the evidence their own eyes, at least agreeing with the group's obviously wrong. What does this show us? That the functional stupidity Bonhoeffer identified has a deeply sociological dimension. It is not just an individual failure, but a human vulnerability to conformity pressure. A tendency to doubt our own perceptions when they contradict the apparent consensus of the group. As Asch wrote, the tendency to conformity in our society is so strong that reasonably intelligent and well-meaning people are willing to call white black. Cognitive dissonance, the defense against inconvenient truth. In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger proposed the theory of cognitive dissonance, which explains one of the most fundamental mechanisms behind functional stupidity. The theory is elegantly simple. Our brain experiences a profound psychological discomfort when confronted with information that contradicts our established beliefs. To alleviate this discomfort, we have two options: change our beliefs, difficult and psychologically costly, or reject, distort the information, easier and inevitably, unless we have developed specific mental habits to resist this tendency, our brain will choose the path of least resistance, rejecting the evidence rather than revising the belief. Festinger studied this in a group that believed in the end of the world on a specific date. When the date passed without the apocalypse, instead of abandoning their belief, the group members strengthened it, developing elaborate explanations about how their faith had saved the world. This mechanism explains why intelligent people can cling to manifestly false beliefs, even when confronted with overwhelming contrary evidence. It's not conventional stupidity, but an automatic psychological response to protect the ego and the identity built around certain beliefs. Mental shortcuts. The lazy brain. Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist who received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on decision-making, offers the third pillar for understanding functional stupidity. In his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman describes how our brain operates in two distinct systems. System 1, fast, automatic, emotional, unconscious, and requiring little effort. System 2, slow, deliberate, logical, conscious, and requiring significant mental effort. For evolutionary reasons, our brain is programmed to save energy. Using System 2 is metabolically costly. As a result, whenever possible, we delegate decisions to System 1, which operates through heuristics, mental shortcuts, and biases. This makes us vulnerable to simple, emotionally resonant, but often wrong narrative. As Kahneman wrote, a law of least effort governs thinking. If there are several ways to approach a problem, we tend to choose the least demanding. This is a fundamental cognitive vulnerability that explains why even highly intelligent people can fall into flawed reasoning when the topic is emotionally charged, or when a simple, albeit false, narrative competes with a complex reality that would require the effort of System 2 to be properly processed. These three psychological mechanisms, social conformity, cognitive dissonance, and reliance on mental shortcuts have always been part of the human condition. But what Bonhoeffer could not have predicted in his Nazi prison cell is how the modern world perfect storm that would amplify these vulnerabilities to unprecedented levels. Now, imagine these brain mechanisms being exploited, not by a single totalitarian regime with limited technologies, but by sophisticated technological systems specifically designed to capture and monetize our attention. A 2018 study conducted by MIT showed that, on Twitter, false news spreads 6 times faster than true news. Why? Because our System 1, emotional, fast, prone to biases, is activated by content that provokes outrage, fear, or surprise. Social media algorithms are designed to maximize engagement, not truth or critical thinking. They have learned, through billions of interactions, that content that activates strong emotions generates more clicks, shares, and screen time, all converted into advertising revenue. This creates a perverse reinforcement cycle. The more we react emotionally, System 1, the more similar content we receive, leading us increasingly into echo chambers where our worldview is constantly confirmed and rarely challenged. The perfect environment for functional stupidity to As researcher Tristan Harris, former ethical designer at Google, observed, "If you're not paying for the product, you are the product." Our cognitive vulnerabilities are not unfortunate side effects of digital systems. They are the resource being exploited. In a world of increasing complexity and economic insecurity, many of us adopt what economists call rational ignorance, the perfectly rational decision to remain uninformed about complex issues because the cost of being adequately informed is high and the individual benefit of being well informed is small. It is easier and psychologically more comforting to accept simplistic slogans and apparently clear solutions to intricate problems such as climate change, economic inequality, or geopolitical conflicts. Functional stupidity becomes an adaptive response to a world overloaded with information. As political scientist Michael Huemer wrote, "The average voter has political beliefs that are systematically distant from established facts, not because they are stupid, but because they are responding to rational incentives." If all this already seems alarming, consider the new frontier that is opening up. The era of generative artificial intelligence, deepfakes, and algorithms that not only select realities, but can fabricate them to measure. We are entering an era where the distinction between true and false will become increasingly difficult, even for experts. Technologies such as GPT-4, DALL-E, and deepfake tools already allow creating fake content indistinguishable from real for the casual observer. In a world where any image, video, or audio can be convincingly falsified, where AI can generate persuasive texts in any style or perspective, and where increasingly sophisticated algorithms can direct this content specifically to your individual psychological vulnerabilities, the functional stupidity, identified by Bonhoeffer, may become not just common, but practically inevitable without specific countermeasures. As historian Yuval Noah Harari observed, "In the information age, ignorance is not the result of lack of information, but of not knowing what is relevant." This is the anatomy of functional stupidity, not a defect of some individuals of low intelligence, but a universal human vulnerability that is being systemically exploited and amplified by the technological, economic, and social systems we have built. The question is no longer just about political propaganda or ideological brainwashing as in Bonhoeffer's time. It's about entire architectures of influence that exploit precisely the flaws in our mental operating system that he identified almost 8 decades ago. And just as Bonhoeffer recognized that functional stupidity represented a greater threat than evil, we must recognize that these systems of cognitive exploitation potentially represent a greater threat to rational civilization than any conventional weapon or. But there is hope. Just as we can scientifically understand the mechanisms of functional stupidity, we can also develop specific countermeasures, both personal and social, to resist it. And that's what we'll explore next. If our brains and the systems around us are programmed to make us functionally stupid, is there hope? How can we fight back against mechanisms so deeply rooted in our psychology and so sophisticatedly exploited by our technologies and social structures? The answer is not simple, but it is possible. And it begins with a concept that was at the center of Bonhoeffer's thinking, albeit in a different theological context. Bonhoeffer is known for his concept of costly grace, the idea that true spiritual grace, unlike cheap grace, demands something from us. It is not simply delivered, it requires effort, sacrifice, and we can apply this same principle to thinking. Truth, not the easy and comfortable truth of opinion bubbles and simplistic narratives, but the complex and sometimes uncomfortable truth of reality, demands something from us. It requires what modern psychologists call intellectual humility, the courage to admit that we may be wrong. Intellectual humility is not weakness or indecision. On the contrary, it is a form of strength, the strength to face the possibility of, to resist the comfort of absolute certainty, to embrace complexity rather than retreat to simplification. As Bonhoeffer wrote, the test of the moral character of a society is what it does for its children. We can adapt this to our topic. The test of a person's intellectual character is what they do with information that contradicts their deepest beliefs. This is the philosophical basis of our fight against functional stupidity, recognizing that true thinking is costly, uncomfortable, and difficult, but that this cost is worth it, because the alternative is the surrender of our mental autonomy to forces that do not have our best interest in mind. Concrete practices, strategies of resistance. Philosophy without practice is sterile. So, how do we translate this understanding into concrete actions that can help us resist functional stupidity in our daily lives? Here are 4 specific practices, based on both Bonhoeffer's observations and the findings of modern psychology. Practice intellectual friction. Cognitive dissonance leads us to avoid information that contradicts our beliefs. The solution? Face this tendency directly, actively seeking the best arguments against your strongest beliefs. Not the weakest arguments, which would be easy to dismiss, but the strongest ones, those that an intelligent and well-intentioned opponent might present. This deliberate practice of exposure to intellectual discomfort strengthens the mental muscles that resist functional stupidity. In practice, identify an important political, social, or scientific belief. Dedicate 30 minutes per week to reading respectable sources from the other side that present the strongest arguments against your position. Not to change your mind, but to genuinely understand the counter-perspective. As John Stuart Mill wrote, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of." Embrace productive ignorance. One of the clearest signs of functional stupidity is the inability to seriously consider the possibility of absolute certainty, especially on complex topics, is almost always a sign of unexamined thinking. Regularly ask this question: what would make me change my mind on this subject? If your sincere answer is, nothing could make me change, this is a red flag. You are not thinking about the subject, you are just believing in it. Productive ignorance is recognizing the limits of your knowledge and using them as a starting point for investigation, not as an endpoint for dogmatism. It's the difference between "I don't know, so I should find out," and "I don't know, so I should pretend that I know." As philosopher Bertrand Russell observed, the trouble with the world is that the stupid are always confident, while the intelligent are full of doubts. Slow down sharing. One of the main ways functional stupidity spreads in our digital age is through the impulsive sharing of information that confirms our beliefs, without proper verification. Establish for yourself the 60-second rule. Before sharing any provocative content, especially one that strongly confirms your views, wait at least a minute and verify the information from an independent source. This simple friction, this small delay between impulse and action, may be enough to activate your system 2, slow and deliberate thinking, and interrupt the cycle of misinformation that feeds functional stupidity. As Bonhoeffer reminded, the essence of impatience is wanting to harvest before sowing. In the case of information, the impatience to share before verifying is the seed of functional stupidity. Normalize "I don't know." In a culture that values absolute certainties and winning debates, one of the most powerful phrases you can master is, "I don't know enough about this to have a firm opinion." This is not weakness. It's intellectual honesty. It's recognizing that the world is complex, that no one can be an expert in everything, and that it's better to suspend judgment than to adopt positions based on inadequate information. This practice not only protects you from functional stupidity, but also creates social space for others to admit their own uncertainty, a powerful cultural countercurrent against polarization based on unexamined certainties. As physicist Richard Feynman said, "I would rather have questions that cannot be answered than answers that cannot be questioned." Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not just a theorist who wrote about functional stupidity from his cell. He lived his convictions to the end, paying with his own life. When he was arrested by the Gestapo for his participation in the German resistance, he could have chosen the easy path: renounce his convictions, adapt to the regime, preserve his life. Instead, he maintained his intellectual and moral independence until the moment he was led to the scaffold in April 1945. Bonhoeffer died defending the possibility of genuine human thought in an era of forced conformity. He understood, on a deeply personal level, that when we stop thinking for ourselves, when we succumb to functional stupidity, whether out of fear, convenience, or conformity, we become puppets of forces we do not control. His legacy is not just theological or historical. It is a call to continuous vigilance against the internal and external forces that threaten our mental autonomy, a call that resonates more strongly today in our era of algorithmic manipulation and information overload than perhaps at any time since the fall of Nazism. Bonhoeffer's final message to us, adapted to our time, can be summarized thus: the central question is not whether you are intelligent in the conventional sense. It's not your IQ, your degrees, or your vocabulary. The fundamental question is whether you have an intellectual courage to think for yourself, when it would be easier, more comfortable, and more socially rewarding to simply go with the flow. This is a choice that each of us faces daily, often without realizing it. When we open our social media, when we consume news, when we participate in political or social conversations, we are constantly deciding whether we will exercise our mental autonomy or surrender it to the comfort of and that choice has consequences. As we've seen, functional stupidity is not benign. When multiplied by millions, it can destroy democracies, fuel extremism, and even threaten the habitability of. In a world that literally profits from your intellectual surrender, where technology companies, politicians, and countless other actors have financial and power incentives to exploit your cognitive vulnerabilities, thinking with care, skepticism, and humility is not just a personal virtue. It is the most important form of resistance. As Bonhoeffer wrote, "It is not for us to predict the day, but live it." And living fully in the complex 21st century requires precisely the qualities he exemplified: critical thinking, intellectual integrity, and the courage to resist the tide of functional stupidity, even when it comes at a cost. So, the challenge this week is this: which strongly held belief are you willing to question? Not to necessarily abandon it, but to examine it honestly, considering the possibility that you might be wrong, or that reality might be more complex than your current view allows. I would like to know your perspective in the comments. If this video brought any valuable reflection to you, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more content that invites deep thinking. Each new subscription motivates us to continue exploring ideas that matter, that explore the depths of the human mind. This channel is dedicated to exploring the frontiers of human thought, not to entertain, although we hope it is engaging, nor to confirm existing beliefs, but to challenge, expand, and strengthen our active capacity to think clearly in confusing times. So, always remember, be curious, not certain. Protect your mind. Because in a world where so many forces compete to hijack your thinking, intellectual freedom may be the most valuable resource you possess.